So my last name, being Riley, is obviously Irish. My family's namesake originates from the county Cavan in Ireland. In actuality, I'm really somewhat of a mutt, but the majority of my ancestry is from the British Isles. So in looking for a sword that could capture that part of my heritage, I wanted something that would catch the eye, but would also be ultra functional. So, by popular demand, here is the Albion Gallowglass. The term Galloglas is an Anglicization of the Irish Gallogla, foreign soldier, incorporating the word Oglach, which is derived from Oak, the Old Irish for youths, but later meaning soldier. The Galloglas were a mercenary warrior elite among the Gaelic Norse clans residing in the Highlands and the Western Isles of Scotland, or Hebrides, from the mid-13th century to the end of the 16th century. As Scots, their tradition descended from the Irish, but they had intermarried with the 10th century Norse settlers of the islands and coastal areas of Scotland, as well as the Picts. So the Irish called them the Gael, foreign Gaels. They were the mainstay of Scottish and Irish warfare before the advent of gunpowder, and dependent upon seasonal service with Irish lords. A military chieftain would often select a Galloglas to serve as his personal aide and bodyguard, because, as a foreigner, the Galloglas would not be as subject to local feuds and influences. The first record of Galloglas service under the Irish was in 1259, when Prince Aed O'Connor of Connaught would receive a dowry of 160 Scottish warriors from the daughter of the King of Hebrides. They were organized into groups known as the Corra, which consisted of about 100 men. In return for military service, the Galloglas contingents were given land and settled in Irish lordships, where they were entitled to receive supplies from the local population. By 1512, there were reported to be 59 groups throughout the country under the control of the Irish nobility. Though initially they were mercenaries, over time they settled, and their ranks became filled with native Irish men. They were noted for wielding the two-handed Sparta axe, a custom noted by Giraldus Cambrensis to have derived from their Norse heritage, and a broadsword or claymore. For armor, the Galloglas wore chainmail shirts over padded jackets and iron helmets on the head. He was usually accompanied by two boys, one of whom carried his javelins or throwing spears, while the other carried his provisions. The importation of Galloglas into Ireland was a major factor in containing the Anglo-Norman invasion of the 12th century, as their ranks stiffened the resistance of the Irish lordships. Throughout the Middle Ages in Ireland, Galloglas troops were maintained by Gaelic Irish and Hiberno-Norman lords alike. Even the English Lord Deputy of Ireland usually kept a company of them in his service. The 16th century in Ireland saw an escalation in military conflict caused by the Tudor reconquest of Ireland. Galloglas fighters were joined by native Irish mercenaries called bunad, literally quartered men, and by newer Scottish mercenaries known as redshanks. The flow of mercenaries into Ireland was such a threat to English occupation that Queen Elizabeth took steps against them in 1571, around 700 of them being executed after the first of the Desmond rebellions. In spite of the increased use of firearms in Irish warfare, Galloglas remained an important part of Hugh O'Neill's forces in the 9 Years' War in Ireland. After the combined Irish defeat at the Battle of Kinsale in 1601, recruitment of Galloglas waned, although Scottish Highland mercenaries continued to come to Ireland until the 1640s. Notably, Alasdair MacCulloch. Though the Galloglas ceased as a military unit, their family names live on to this day, often concentrated in areas where their ancestors were settled in the service of Irish lordships. The most common names derived from Galloglas families include McSweeney, McDonald, McSheehy, McDougall, McCabe, and McRory. Our Galloglas is patterned after the large swords carried by its namesake, with a blade of Type 19. Oakeshott describes the Type 19 as having a broad, flat blade that has clearly chamfered edges that run nearly parallel, a fuller that runs through the upper third, and a flat ricasso section at the base of the blade. The blade is of a hexagonal cross-section. The specifications of this sword are: the overall length is 47.5 inches, the blade length is 37.375 inches, the blade width is 1.6925 inches, the center of gravity is 6.5 inches, the center of percussion is 23.75 inches. The weight is 2 pounds 9 ounces. The Galloglas has a retail price of $1,430. The specifications and design of this sword are by renowned swordsmith Peter Johnson. In some ways, I wonder what I can say about this sword that isn't pretty well summed up in the pictures. I mean, just take a look at it. It really is that gorgeous. Okay, so I'd be lying if I said that I didn't have anything to say, so we'll look over some of the details in a moment. Now, I mentioned in my Albion Ringek review the phrase simple, clean lines, and I'll modify that concept for this sword and make it just 2 words: simple elegance. While it maintains Albion's usually tame and straightforward design aesthetic, it still has just enough detail to catch the eye. The blade is narrow with a hexagonal cross-section design and almost parallel edges, which has a fuller down half the length. The blade itself is not very thick, and coupled with the blade shape, it is a visual indicator that it is a sword that is quick and sharp. Etched around the fuller is some light geometry, and at the ricasso is a more heavily etched scrollwork. What's strange about the etchings on this sword is how when you view the sword as a whole, these etchings kind of fade into the overall design, and you don't notice them directly, so much as they just accentuate the sword visually. Simple elegance. The crossguard is an Oakeshott Style 6 with quatrefoils cut into either end. I'll speak more about this in my conclusion section. What I especially love about the crossguard is the detail you don't notice at first, right in the center, which again is a subtle detail that makes the sword visually exciting while keeping the simple elegance. The grip is a simple affair on this sword, but that isn't to say that it isn't perfectly crafted. Mine is dyed black because I wanted the sword to remain monochromatic for a very good reason, but I'll speak to that in a moment. And finally, what is probably the most defining feature of this sword is the pommel. This is a disc-shaped pommel, except that it is hollow and open, exposing the tang of the sword, which goes through a peen block and has a nice clean peen that is hard to see. Now, I mentioned that I chose the black grip because I wanted the sword to be monochromatic, and I think it has a lot to do with putting the emphasis on the sword design as a whole. To show you what I mean, let's just take a look at the sword's silhouette. You see, even in just a silhouette, it is a very recognizable sword design, and I didn't really want anything to detract from that sword's look, even in the light of day. Overall, I think we can agree, this is one beautiful sword. As of the filming of this review, this is probably the most ultra-functional sword that I own, which is really no surprise seeing as how it is a bastard sword. Now what I mean by this is that the sword can be effectively used with one hand or two. Though mind you, because of the pommel design, it probably isn't ideally used like a long sword. Now this sword is very light at 2 pounds 9 ounces. It's about a full pound lighter than the Ringek, and as such the weight, one-handed or two, is just not an issue. In fact, it feels so well balanced and so light in the hand that I think my accuracy and cut tests have actually vastly improved when using it. And of course, it comes sharp right out of the box, so it cuts really well. Now I haven't used or abused this sword in any way so that the edge damage would actually occur, but from what I know about my other Albion swords, this blade would hold up against wear very well. That is because the blade is a properly tempered 6150 steel. Now, just like my Ringek review, I really have nothing negative to say about this sword. And I promise that isn't always going to be the case with an Albion, but it is the case with this one. The only thing that I will note is that it probably isn't as good at thrusting as, say, something like the Ringek, but that is by design, and it's still very functional in that regard. Now, I'm going to leave the functionality portion of this review here because as I'll note in a moment, my experience with this sword is a little bit less than it normally would be. Just know that the sword, like all Albions, is supremely functional. The Galloglass is probably the most prized sword in my collection. It is certainly the centerpiece, the apogee, the capstone of my collection, and I don't think that is likely to change anytime soon. Now, the primary reason behind this, beyond the fact that it is an Albion, or that it's expensive, or that it's one of only 100 that will ever be made, is that it is probably the best embodiment of my own cultural heritage that I could find in a sword. My heritage is an important aspect of who I am. It's one of the reasons that I've decided to change the location of this review to show off my heraldry banner a bit more in the background. And the Galloglass is just that. It's a bit of a nod to my heritage. But it's also a bit of a nod to my background in sword collecting. I've mentioned in previous videos that my first sword was a wall hanger claymore. Now, the quatrefoil that is so oftenly identified with the claymore is actually present right here in the Galloglass. So in some ways, I view it as a good reflection of where I started in sword collecting and where I am now. Now, this is all to say that I purchased this sword more for what it represents, as a piece of art, as a piece of my own heritage, and maybe as a little bit of Scotch-Irish history. This is one of my functional swords that I'll probably go out of my way to keep in pristine condition. So to that end, I don't actually use it all that much. And I tend to just add Renaissance wax to it instead of oil, and I let it hang proudly on my wall. I want it to remain forever in its Scotch-Irish perfection. This is the Albion Gallowglass. I give it a 5 out of 5.